In this tutorial, we're going to be talking about the user interface. Let's start with the main window. The main window is referred to as the real-time view. That's because this is where all the real-time rendering takes place, and any adjustments you make to your materials or lighting are displayed here in real time. Also, as you move your camera, the real-time view updates and shows you a different angle on your model. When working in KeyShot, you will commonly use sets of hotkey combinations and mouse combinations to work more efficiently. If at any time you forget what these combinations are, you can always press the K key, and this will pull up the hotkeys list, and you'll always have that there for your reference. On the bottom of the real-time view, you'll notice the main toolbar. This toolbar will walk you through the process of creating images in KeyShot. Everything from importing your data, to assigning materials and environment lighting from the library, to tuning your lighting and materials in the project window, to setting up animations, saving out screenshots of the real-time view, and doing final renders of images, turntables, or animations. Let's go ahead and talk about how you can move this toolbar. If I click on the left side of the toolbar, that will change the icon and you can make it floating. You can also snap the toolbar to the side, and you can choose to hide the text and display the icons in 3 different sizes, which would be small, medium, and large. You do that by right-clicking on the toolbar and choosing which option you would like. Let's go ahead and talk about the preferences. So I'll go ahead and pull up the Preferences menu and walk you through what all this is. In Preferences, under the General tab, we have Adjust Aspect Ratio to Backplate. And what this means is when you're working in KeyShot, you can choose to view your model against the environment lighting, a solid color, or you can choose a background image. When you choose a background image, you can drag and drop it into the interface. And if this option is checked in Preferences, that means it will automatically resize the real-time view to match the aspect ratio of your background image. Enable Auto Update will check for updates every time KeyShot is started. Pause Real-Time Render. This will allow you to let KeyShot automatically pause the real-time render and stop the activity on your processors after any given time that you set. Under the Screenshot section, you can choose what format you would like to save your screenshots out as, and that can either be JPEG or PNG. You can ask where to save each screenshot, so every time you press the Screenshot button, KeyShot will prompt you to which directory you'd like to save that to, and you can choose to save a camera with each screenshot. I definitely recommend keeping this on. It's nice that when you are saving out your views, you can always go back to your camera tab, and as long as this box is checked, every time you press Screenshot, a camera will be saved for that screenshot. So you can always go back and check any previous view that you might have saved a screenshot from. Next, let's move on to the interface. And under this section, you can choose to display the interface in several different languages. Once you choose a language, you will have to restart KeyShot for the changes to apply. Transparent windows will make the windows of the user interface slightly transparent. And Enable Object Highlight is a very useful feature. This will basically highlight parts in the real-time view when you have them selected in your scene tree. And so what I mean by that is if we go to the project window here, your hierarchy from your CAD system is retained. So if you select an element of your hierarchy and Enable Object Highlight is enabled in the Preferences, it will highlight that part in the real-time view. Definitely helps while working with your models. And here are some settings for your 3D connection mouse. You can increase or decrease sensitivity if you have a mouse. And let's talk about the folders. Okay, this is a very important concept. As you know from the directory structure tutorial, this is where all your assets are basically loaded from. So you can set a default path for your textures, your backplates, your environments, materials, where your renderings are saved out to, where your scenes are saved to, and where your animations are rendered out to. One of the nice things about this, if you are working as part of a team, maybe there's a group of designers that you have at your office, and you would like everybody to be using the same environments and materials, you can always set this path to a network location, and that will keep everybody on the same page. Under the Plugins tab, you can go ahead and install new plugins or refresh plugins. And under Advanced, the first option in the list is Fast Real-Time Updates. This will allow the fluid camera movements around your model. If you have this unchecked, you will notice some skipping and jumping as you move around the model. So this is probably one of those settings you can go ahead and just enable and then forget about it. Under the Network tab, this will be more for your IT departments. If you are behind a proxy server, you can enter some settings in here that will allow KeyShot to connect to our server for licensing and also the auto updates. So that's a rundown of the preferences. Let's move on to the library. Okay. So the library you can think of is this is where all your assets are stored. And the first item in the tab is materials. All these materials are loaded from your hard drive, and they're all loaded from the path that you have set in preferences to your materials folder. Should you add materials to your hard drive, you can always press refresh and that will update your materials list. Next you have environments. This is where all your lighting environments are stored, and you can drag and drop your environments from here into your real-time view, and that will change out your lighting. Next you have backplates. This is where all your backplates are stored. If you would like to use a background image, simply drag and drop one out of the interface and that will enable that background image. This is where your textures are stored. You can always drag and drop one from the library onto your model. And this is where any renderings or screenshots that you save out will be saved to. So the main thing to think of about the library is this is where all your assets are stored. Now the other component of working in KeyShot is going to be the project window. Okay? And this here you can think of as this is where you make changes. This is where you make things happen. So the first item in the list is going to be the scene tree. This will display the hierarchy of your model. From in here you can click and select parts and assemblies. And you can also hide assemblies by clicking the checkbox next to them. You can also adjust the position of your model down in the position parameters. You can snap to ground, you can center your model in the world, and you can reset its position to where it was on an initial import. Okay, let's move on to the material tab. This will be the last selected material, and the parameters for that material will be displayed here. So if I double click on a material on the model, that's going to pull up the properties. So that will automatically open up the project window for you and display the parameters for that material. So again, the project window, this is where you make changes. So if you want to make a change to a certain material, you can click on the parameters, and this is where you make all that happen. And as we know, since KeyShot is a real-time renderer, all the changes update in the real-time view. We'll get into more of the specifics of editing materials in a later tutorial. So for now, we'll move on to the Environment tab. And here is where all the settings exist for your environment lighting. You can choose to increase or decrease contrast. You can increase or decrease brightness. So if you want to lighten up your scene or darken up your scene, that's done here. You can also increase or decrease the size and adjust the height. So if I do this, you'll notice that the environment size will change. I can drop the height. And this is basically a method of controlling the lighting and reflections. And you can also rotate your environment. And down here, you can choose to display your lighting environment as the background, a solid color as the background, or use a backplate image. Also, you can enable ground shadows and ground reflections. And under advanced, you can tune your shadow color. One way this is useful is if your shadow looks too dark, you can always go in here and start to brighten this value, and that will lighten up your shadow, or it will simulate lightening up your shadow. You can choose to flatten the ground, and what this will do, since KeyShot does contain your model inside of a sphere, it will flatten this ground and give your model a flat surface to rest on when you're using the lighting environment as your background image. The ground size is going to control the ground grid that your shadow gets projected on. So basically there is an invisible ground plane that the shadow gets displayed on. And if this is too small, your shadow can end up being clipped, as we can see back here on this side. So you can see that the shadow just suddenly stops, and the reason for that is the ground size. Notice as I increase this, that shadow extends out, and I can keep increasing this. And what you'll want to do is find the optimal ground size. You want it just large enough to contain your shadow, and preferably no larger than that. And that basically helps with displaying a higher quality shadow without using a whole lot of rendering power. So it's an optimization thing. Under the camera tab, we do have all the camera settings. This is where you can access any saved views, any screenshots that you saved out. So as I mentioned in the preferences menu, you can choose to save a screenshot or save a camera for each screenshot. And this is where those are saved. So if I click on one of those, that will take me back to the view that I had saved out. And also any cameras that you save are stored here. Now we will cover all these parameters in later tutorials on the camera, so I won't get into those in this lesson. And let's move on to the settings. These are basically all the settings that will make your real-time view look the way it does. And again, we will cover these in more detail in a later tutorial. Okay, so far we've talked about preferences. We've talked about the library, which is where assets are stored. We've talked about the project window. This is where you make things happen. And let's go ahead and talk about the render menu. So when you are ready to render out your image, you can go ahead and click on the render button. And the first item in the list is output. Here you can choose to do still image or animation. The animation output will be covered in the animation section of tutorials. So for image output, you can set a name. You can choose a folder. By default, this will automatically point to where you have your renderings folder set to in your preferences. But if you would like to set a different folder for this particular render, you can change that. You can also set an output type, JPEG, TIFF, EXR, or TIFF32. You can choose to include an alpha channel, set your resolution, and also set print size if you are working in print. You also have render in background. If you have this box selected, you can tell KeyShot to go ahead and render the current image and still continue to work in the real-time view. If you don't have this checked when you press render, what that's going to do is pause the real-time view and use all your processing power to render the current image. Next, you have the quality tab, and we do cover the render settings in another tutorial, so you can check that out if you're having trouble finding out which ones you need to increase based on what you're rendering. But you also have different methods of rendering. You can choose maximum time. So if you know how much time you have till your deadline, You can set this in hours, minutes, seconds, and milliseconds if you so choose. And this will give you the best quality image that it can in the amount of time that you set. Maximum samples. This is another method of outputting your images. And this will basically calculate an image up to a given amount of samples. And again, we will cover this in later tutorials. And you have advanced control where you can control each element of the render settings independently. You also have the render queue. Here's where you can add jobs, delete jobs, and process any jobs. This is very useful if you're working throughout the day and you don't want to tie up your machine. So you can add jobs to the render queue throughout the day, and then when you go home for the evening, go ahead and select process queue, and it will run through all those jobs for you. And when you come back to the office the next day, all your images will be ready for you. And you also have region render, and this will allow you to render only small sections of your image. And this is really useful if you want to test your render settings on certain areas, make sure that the quality level that you've set is enough, or if you want to replace certain elements of an already rendered image. Maybe you want to only replace one portion of your model, but you don't want to render the whole image again. You can always do a region render of that area and then replace that using Photoshop. Okay, for information on the animation section, please see the animation portion of the tutorials, and that about covers it for the user interface. So we'll see you for the next tutorial.